Blessed be the tie that binds our hearts in Christian love. I have so much appreciated this service this morning. It has ministered already to my heart. Sister Asbury's testimony, what a blessing to my heart to hear her testimony, and the rest of the testimonies as well. But I especially wanted to say I went to Sister Glick and to Sister Connie before the service just to whisper to them how much I appreciated their beautiful music. I don't know what music means to you, but it just absolutely ministers to my heart. And as they were playing before the service, I told the Lord, Lord, I could listen to this for a long, long time. There's something invigorating, there is something building, there is something edifying in music that is beautiful, in music that has meaning. And I just want to thank God for the music of this camp meeting, what it already has meant to me. Of course, Brother and Sister Glick, you never have to worry about that. You always know you're going to get something good when the Glicks sing, and I thank God for it. And I want to say something about books this morning. Something was mentioned about the Moores and their books, and I hope that everybody has books in your home. And if you have some, well, I'd just like to suggest while you're here, you buy more books. All right, now you might catch that eventually. But anyhow, there are more books outside of the tabernacle, and you probably need to check through that. And so I'm not here to advocate any book club, neither the convention. Well, it's not actually the convention. The Shmuel Publishing Company and Allegheny and Bill Snyder and all the rest of them. It's not my purpose. But I did receive an interesting book in one of the packets that I received Monday before I came up here. And I have not seen the book. I mean, I have the old edition of it, but I haven't seen this one until just Monday of this week. It's called The Revival Secret, and it is written by H. Rob French. And for those of us, especially out of my background, who were impacted by Brother French, this will read like something we used to hear him preach. And I was mightily impacted as a child and a young person by the ministry of Brother French and others like him. That's my background. And one of the things that French says here, this is a book about revival. It is a story, but it is drawn from facts and experiences. And he says, if sinners are not saved, it is largely because they are not convicted. If they are not convicted, it is because the church is not burdened. If the church is not burdened, it is because the Holy Spirit is not operating through her. If the Spirit does not operate, it is because there is a condition there which is offensive to Him. And years ago, I read that little book, and it touched me deeply. And if you want to take a look at it, I'm going to leave it here. I do have a copy of my own, and I will not let that one go, incidentally. But if you want to look at it while I'm here, you're welcome to pick it up and read it as far as that's concerned. And perhaps it will be a blessing to you, and you will also find out where you can get it. And again, I don't want to make a spectacle of any one individual. I know that the other morning when I spoke, I mentioned about Joe McPherson being here and his wife, and Joe is back with us again today. And some of you may have read his mother's books without knowing who she was. If you have ever read anything of Anna Talbot McPherson's books, this is Sister McPherson's son, her oldest son. Many of those books are, I guess you'd say, vignettes of the saints of yesteryear. Some of them well known and others of them almost completely unknown. But all of them written very, very beautifully and very effectively. And in that same packet of books, I received the newest book by Anna Talbot McPherson called Vignettes of Faithfulness. And the artwork on this book, front and back, is some of Sister McPherson's calligraphy, in which she writes scripture or whatever she may be writing, and then out of her writing she makes a picture. All right? And if you look now, there's an error on the cover. All right? That's why I'm kind of holding it. I didn't know whether I was going to show it to you or not, because I don't want you to be distracted by the error. I called the publisher this morning and I said, is there some kind of a story behind why you have a misspelled word on the cover of that book? He said, Brother Sankey, there's no story. He said it went through 5 or 6 proofreaders and nobody caught it. And I opened up the package and I looked at it, and I caught it first thing off. It's on the front and it's on the rib. But that doesn't detract from what I'm needing to say. She takes her calligraphy, and this picture that you can see of the head of Christ, I'm assuming as a child, is done with calligraphy. She's taking scripture and she writes it out, and then out of her writing she makes these pictures. And those pictures are actually available. You can contact her daughter, let me see, through her daughter, I guess it is. Let me see. Yes, her daughter, Mrs. Carolyn Shreve, and it gives an address here, so you can actually get the pictures of that calligraphy. But anyhow, here's a new book just recently out by Sister McPherson and Joe. We're indebted to your mom, and we'll just say thanks to you. And Joe writes a very nice foreword here to the book about the author. And as I look at those things, you know, I'm old enough now that I'm beginning to be reflective, and I am beginning to look back. I'm beginning even sometimes to be a little bit nostalgic, and that's kind of, you know, that's kind of scary when you get nostalgic when you're as young as I am. But I'm just old enough to begin to be thinking in those terms, and I thought of Sister McPherson this morning. She had a Quaker background. She was a gracious lady, always dressed so neatly and so modestly, and she had a modest demeanor, and she was a quiet woman, a very stately lady. And when I saw that, some of the memories of Sister McPherson came back. And I remember that in 1962, when we were appointed to go to Guatemala for our first time, and of course, we were appointed under evangelistic faith missions, but my membership from my childhood or my associations had been in the Allegheny Conference of the Wesleyan Methodist Church. So we went back to conference, and they received us warmly, even though we were not going out under them. And actually, because the merger was coming up, they actually placed us under appointment as missionaries under appointment, even though technically we were still a part of the Wesleyan Methodist Church. And they asked Janet and I to sing for one of the women's missionary meetings. And so we went to the women's missionary meeting to sing, and Sister McPherson gave the devotional. And I'm going to tell you her text that morning to tell you what kind of a lady she was, because not many people could take the text and make a devotional out of it, but she did. And her text was, "Deep calleth unto deep at the noise of thy waterspouts." Well, I'll tell you, I've never tackled that one. But Sister McPherson did, and she did a beautiful job of talking to us about the deep things of God. Deep calleth unto deep at the sound of thy waterspouts. I don't know why my heart is as burdened as it is. I'm just a little perplexed. I know that what I've talked about the other morning perhaps would not be considered appropriate for camp meeting, and especially coming down towards the weekend. But for some reason, I have not been able to break away from the burden that I sensed on my heart. I knew before I came up here on Monday, I knew that I was supposed to preach that first night from Isaiah chapter 6. I knew that, but from that point on, I had no idea what was going to happen. And after I got here and thinking about Isaiah's vision, I got to thinking about our vision and how we need to see God. and the things that keep us from seeing God as we should. Isaiah's was a transforming vision, but sometimes we Christians have a blurred vision. And so I felt like the Lord wanted me to talk to you about some of the things, some of the obstacles that keep us from seeing as we ought to see. And I think, I guess my burden is not just for the Pilgrim Holiness people, but my burden is for our holiness people, our movement. Because I think I see things happening that if they are not reversed, either by conscious decision of people like you and me in this auditorium, or if they are not reversed by a mighty revival from heaven, I think we are seeing the demise of who we are. Now, that's not meant to be calamity howling. I hope you understand. I am part of you. This is where I am always going to be. Where I started out, that's where I intend to die, God being my helper. I'm not going anywhere else, so please don't be alarmed by what I'm saying. But if we look around, we see that little by little, by sometimes tiny increments, the things that distinguish us as a holy people and holiness people are being chipped away from who we are. There was a Methodist bishop who made this comment. He said, "We must be who we are." Now, I don't know all that Methodist bishop meant, but I would just like to tell you as holiness people, I'm just going to take you all in this morning, tell you that we must be who we are. We can't be someone else and be true to our heritage and to our history. I would also like to suggest, especially to our pastors, but to our lay people who may have an interest, that if you have not already done so, that you read the book, Historical Drift. I made a comment about it in a Convention Herald of maybe a year ago. Historical Drift by Arnold Cook. It is a fascinating book, and it paints a picture that somehow we need to get a hold of that picture. Along with it, I would also suggest that you read Brian Black's book on the heritage of the holiness movement. I believe that you ought to read Wallace Thornton's book on radical righteousness. And all three of them will give you a grasp of some of the concerns that are on my heart this morning. Isaiah writes that he saw the Lord, and I want to see the Lord. But unless I am careful, and unless you, Mr. Stetler, unless you are careful, there will be things that will blur our vision of who God is. And ladies and gentlemen, we cannot afford to lose our vision. We cannot afford to lose the clarity of who God is. And in the other morning service, I was talking to you about our confrontation with the culture. I made myself, I guess you would say, more vulnerable than I ever have been in a public service in telling you about the effects of culture shock when we went to Central America. The culture shock did something to me. I thank God that whatever may have happened, that God recovered me and we got everything back in gear. But I just felt like God wanted me to talk to you about the terrible effects of culture shock. And the fact that our culture, if we're looking at it and if we are interacting with it, our culture will also shock us to the point where we will lose our perspective of who we are supposed to be. Now, I spent a lot of time on that the other day, so I'm not going to do anything except give you what were going to be my 3 points, and then I want to go on to another area. First of all, there is a culture shock that comes because of the busyness which the culture imposes upon us. You may look at your preacher and you may think that all he has to do is sit in his study, preach a few messages, lead a few services, go to the hospital once in a while, and otherwise things are pretty well, that's just about the end of it. But I need to tell you that preachers and lay people alike are intermingling and interfacing with the culture. And the very fact of our culture, it imposes a busyness on us which affects us spiritually. The devotional time we ought to give, the meditation in which we should engage, the action for God in the church that we should take are oftentimes overwhelmed by the busyness the culture imposes upon us. You say, well, Brother Sankey, is there anything we can do about it? Well, hang on. Let me come to that. But I just need for you to kind of walk with me through some of the things that we're facing as church people. The culture imposes its busyness on us. That adds to what I would call the tyranny of the trivial, getting wrapped up in little bits and pieces of things that soak up our time and leave us without the necessary time to culture our soul. The attraction of the entertainment around us soaks up our time. We are captured by the casualness. I mentioned about casualness, and you may think that I'm way off on this. But you know, when we started our Christian day school, the question came up about whether or not we would have uniforms. And I told them we will have uniforms. My reason being this: like it or not, somewhere along the line, if we allow ourselves to become so casual in our dress and in our attitudes and in the atmosphere in which we live, that ultimately will effect a casualness about our relationship to God. Now, I'm not a prude. I'm not going to stand up here and I hope I don't make a fool out of myself. And I'm not just going to stand up here about a whole bunch of things. I'm just simply telling you this: we need to be careful about our casualness, lest it also effect in us a casualness in our relationship to God. I understand that we can worship God in any kind of circumstance. I've been in the brush arbors, and I've stood out in the open air under trees and everywhere else on the mission field, and some here in the United States. That's not my point. My point is that as a custom and as a discipline of our lives, we need to be careful lest the casualness of the culture affect us and our relationship to God. Now, not only the busyness it imposes, but the basics it ignores. Our culture is ignoring basics. For example, our culture has abandoned even the common decencies of friendliness and courtesy and honesty in favor of gambling, for example. We are supposed to be people of integrity and of honesty and of stewardship. And when we interface with our culture, we are facing a culture that basically has become dishonest and without integrity. Look at what we have seen in the corporate world, where they're supposed to be setting the standard of honesty and integrity. And what have they done? They have shown us a terrible example of corruption and of hatchet jobs and of climbing on the other guy's back in order to climb up myself. Totally antithetical to what the gospel of Jesus Christ teaches us about Christians. the crude language and behavior of the culture around us. And I listen when I go to church. I have lots of people in my church that are working out there in the world, and I listen to them even when they come into church. And just in conversation, you can tell that they have been touched by the crudity of the language and the crudity of the customs of our culture. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm not just pecking away at little things here. I'm trying to tell you, as Christians, we live on a different level than the culture around us. We are men and women of integrity and courtesy and friendliness and honesty and truthfulness, and the culture with which we interact is totally antithetical to what that Christian custom ought to be. We cannot allow ourselves to be captured by the crude language of our culture. Let me tell you a story from my teenage years. I wish now that my folks would have been a little more careful with me than what they were. I certainly tried to be more careful with my children than what my folks were with mine. My folks were good people. But some of these things, they just weren't talked about all that much when we were younger. And so, of course, when I was 12 years of age, I asked permission to have a paper route. And so my folks gave me permission to start carrying the Record Argus, our little hometown paper. And so 6 days a week, I was out there with my paper sack either on my back or on the basket in my bicycle, and riding up and down the streets and avenues of Greenville. And, of course, in those years, we took the papers and we folded them. And then as you rode along, you'd reach in your bag and you'd pull one out and you'd throw it. And of course, you had you had to figure the aerodynamics of the paper you were throwing and the breeze that was blowing. And you also had to take into consideration what you were going to do when your paper ended on the roof of the porch of the house. And some of you evidently have been there, the way you're laughing about it. But anyhow, so I had a paper route. When I got to age 16, I said to my mom and dad, I'd like to get a job at the A&P store. Now, you have to have a few years on you to remember the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company. But the A&P store was the country's largest supermarket chain when I was growing up. And there was one 2 blocks away, and I was in and out of there from my childhood. I knew most of the people in there. And when I was 16 years of age, I asked my dad, can I have permission to get a job? And I went up to the A&P store and filled out an application and talked to Mr. Filer, and Mr. Filer hired me on at 16 years of age, before school and after school, working the dairy and working the produce and working stock. And all of those different kind of things, that's where my work experience started. Well, as a teenager, I was susceptible to a lot of things. And I guess I'm going to just throw in here, and you may boot me out of here before I finish my preaching assignment. I don't know. But I want to tell you moms and dads something. If you have teenagers, this is personal perspective, but it would be far better for your children to be $100 a week poorer than to deliberately and unnecessarily thrust them into the fast food restaurants and the other places where many of our teenagers are working, because many times they go in there ill-equipped to handle the pressures of the language and the customs. It is only a miracle of God, and I'm going to try not to be graphic here, but it is only a miracle of God that I stand here as I am today. Because during those days, just as a teenager, I think by this time I was probably 17 years of age, and there was an older lady in that store, and I want to be careful, but I need to tell you, if it was this way 50 years ago, it hasn't changed. There was an older lady in that store, and her husband was gone for a week or 10 days, and this lady literally threw herself at me and asked me to become involved with her. And it was only a pure miracle of God that kept me from walking out of the car and into the house. I probably would not be standing here today if it wasn't for a mercy of God. But along the way, my mind did start picking up the language. And I'll never forget, on a Friday night was shopping night in those years, and everybody came to the store on Friday night, and so I was working stock because they were buying, and the shelves would become bare, and I'd walk around the store, make a note of what we wanted, and then I'd go back to the stock room and get it, put it on the conveyor belt. And Hilda was back there, and she was our chief marker, and I would put it on the conveyor belt and take the top off and send it down to her. She'd mark it. I'd pick it up, stock the shelves. So I was doing this. And I don't remember now what it was. It seems like it was cereal, but it was something where there were 5 or 6 or 7 boxes stacked high, and I got a hold of a pole, and I got up underneath that and got a hold of that box that I needed, which was right up on top. But in the process of that, the whole line of boxes came tumbling down on top of me, and little boxes and big boxes went flying everywhere, and I was underneath it, and I let out an oath. Never had said one in my life. But I was in that culture. I was in that atmosphere. And evidently it had found its way into my mind somewhere. And in that moment of anger, I let loose with an oath. And here is this woman. And actually this woman that I'm talking about is the same woman who had tried to seduce me. But he was working stock that night. And when I said what I said, she looked at me and she said, "Sankey," she said, "I've never heard you say anything like that before." And oh, what a stab it was that I had maintained at least an outward appearance, that they knew I was different than the rest of them. And yet in a moment of time, I lost it because I had been interacting with the culture and hadn't kept myself where I needed to be spiritually. And so our culture not only imposes its busyness, but it abandons the decencies. It abandons moral restraints. The moral restraints of a civilized society. The sanctity of life. Ladies and gentlemen, I think that we are gaining some ground. But if God doesn't help us to win the victory, we are digging the grave of our civilization because we have lost our sanctity of life perspective. You say, "Well, Brother Sankey, really as old as I am, doesn't make any difference because these are..." I want to tell you it does make a difference. Because if these people have their way, they're going to look at you, ma'am, or look at you, sir, and say they are a useless part of society. We don't need those kind of people. They're soaking up our resources, and we have to pay medical care. And they're going to see if they can't find a way of easing you out of here, sir. And easing you out of here, ma'am. And taking our children that are born to us that maybe are not perfect physically. Why do they cumber the ground? Let's get rid of them. And if we have an attitude, a lack of sanctity of life, it's going to enforce a terrible price upon us somewhere. Not only the sanctity of life, but the sanctity of home and the family. Now, I know that even in a holiness camp meeting, I might step on some toes, and I hope you understand. I'm never put together. I'm not a kind of person that I go after people. I'm not vindictive, but there are times that I have to say some things. And I want to say something, that the scourge, one of the scourges of our culture, is this thing of men and women living together without the benefit of marriage. It's not only being impacted on that line, but now that they want to do away with the concept and the traditional legalities of marriage, what they're really trying to say is that we're ready to destroy the home. And ladies and gentlemen, if there's ever been a time when we ought to be rising up with something akin to righteous indignation, it ought to be right now during this summer when it's going to be considered in the Congress of the United States of America. Will we distinguish marriage as a union between one man and one woman? You say, "Well, it's not going to affect me, Brother Sankey. My home is secure. My marriage is secure. And I hope it is. But I'm going to tell you, it's going to affect your children and it's going to affect your grandchildren, because they're going to grow up and there's not going to be any sense of the biblical concept of what marriage is all about. God said that He created a man and He created a woman, and God attended the first marriage and put His blessing upon it. And He still blesses the marriage of a man and a woman. And I'm not trying to be gross. I'm not trying to be unkind. I'm trying to tell you that it is one of the fundamentals of our culture and of our society. And if they have their way, they will destroy that part of the foundation of United States culture. And in our interaction and our interface, and I can see it. I can see, you listen to that and you read that. And you hear all of their arguments, and little by little, if we're not careful, it begins to wear away. And we begin to say, well, maybe it's not. Yes, it is. It's just as clear and just as definite and just as black and white as I can possibly make it. And it's one of the reasons why the United States of America has arose to the place of prominence and power, because we have recognized the sanctity of the home and the family. They brought in no-fault divorce, and what a fault we're having to deal with today. And any of you who are trying to build churches, you understand just what kind of a problem that is. And sometimes you preach along this line, and I was in a conversation with a lady who had been a nurse with my wife. And they had worked together in one hospital, and then this lady moved over to another hospital. And so we had become friends, and she was a friendly type of an individual and quite open and ebullient. She said, "I'm so glad to see you. My boyfriend and I are getting married, and I'm wondering, would you marry us?" And it happens. Anybody who's out there trying to meet the culture, it happens all the time. I said, I looked at her, and I had nothing but love and kindness in my heart, but I said, whatever her name was, I think it might have been Cheryl. I said, "Cheryl," I said, "listen, I really appreciate you coming to me, and I'd be glad to do anything that I can, but you know, the way I look at it and the way I believe God looks at it, marriage is forever, until death parts that man and that woman." And I said, I'm sorry, but I'm just not going to be able to do it. She said, "So, am I a second-class citizen?" I said, "No, Cheryl, you're not." And she turned and walked away. Well, that's no fun for a preacher who wants to love people and try to bring people to. That's no fun to face that kind of thing. But what I'm trying to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, is that we need to get somewhere down in our thinking that God has set up some pretty fundamental things, and we need to hang on to them, and we need to take our stand, and I believe we can do it gently and carefully and graciously, and with the help of the Holy Spirit. We don't have to just deliberately be offensive to people, but I want to tell you something. If it needs be that we offend somebody, let's offend people, but not offend God. And not only the sanctity of life and the sanctity of the home, but the sanctity of the human body. God planned something higher for these physical bodies of ours than that they be an object. I think part of what has happened is that we have one doctrine that is being taught that tells us that there is evil resident in these physical bodies. So what makes the difference? They're evil. And so what we have is people who have taken what may be in their thinking an evil thing anyhow. What makes the difference? If I disrobe in front of people of the opposite sex. In God's eyes, it makes a lot of difference. And again, I'm not a prude. I don't think I'm insensible to the world that we live in. You may be like me. Not everybody in my family agrees with me. But somewhere, every person who claims to be a Christian has to get something settled in their mind. This is where I'm going to be. And if my brother doesn't see it like I do, or my sister doesn't see it like I do, or if my children don't see it as I do, or if my mom and dad don't see it as I do, between me and the Lord, this is where I have to stand in relationship to this body of mine. Now, I'd like to prove to you that this body is not sinful in itself. The main thing that comes to me is the fact that Jesus Christ, the Son of God, took a human body and lived in it, forever sanctifying the human body. There is nothing wrong with this body. And now you may not say, well, it doesn't look very nice, Brother Sankey. I didn't say that. I said there's nothing wrong with it. It's flesh and it's bones, and it's a marvelous creation of God. To look at a hand, or to think about an eye, or to consider the brain, you have to say how marvelously and how fearfully we are made by God. Our problem is not here. The problem's here. Now, we have a resident, unless God has taken care of it, we have a resident on the inside that gives us a lot of trouble. We have to deal with him. One of the things that he does is he outworks his evil and his iniquity out of his inner residence into or onto the outside. And that's one of the reasons why, as holiness people, we have always maintained that God teaches some measure of modesty. Now, Joe McPherson, when I was growing up in the same group that you grew up in, I can remember my preacher saying this: modesty is not relative. It is absolute. Now hang on a little bit. It'll be all right. I'm not mad at all. They said modesty is not relative. It is absolute. Now I do think that for some of them, that meant that modesty was their absolute of modesty. All right, I'll be honest with you. I think some of them thought that Allegheny, and my Allegheny friends will excuse me here just for a second, that Allegheny and what it said, that was the absolute of modesty. But technically, I don't think that's what they meant. I think what they meant was that scripturally, modesty is an absolute requirement of God. We need to be big enough, we need to be magnanimous enough to allow some measure of latitude on how that is defined. Because you might as well write it down, we'll never all get to exactly the same point as far as what modesty means, much as I wish it would happen. And I do think that a carefulness, living in the Spirit, would bring us closer than what some of us are. But modesty is being lost because our culture has forgotten the sanctity of the human body. And so you walk or you drive down a highway, and what do you see on the billboards? You see bodies that are used as an object to attract attention. And there are few secular magazines which you can pick up and leaf through without somewhere the human body being used as an object. And Lord only knows, and again, I'm not trying to be crude here or unkind, Lord only knows what happens on a television set. I have to be honest, I do not know. So I may be shooting in the dark, but I doubt it. I think we need to be careful. Let's just say that we accept, not saying we should, but let's say that we accept video as a legitimate form of, let's say, entertainment, for the sake of having something to talk about. It is going to be very rare that a commercially produced video does not have something that will be offensive to biblical truth and standards. Whether it's language, or dress, or the introduction of alcoholic beverages, or smoking material, or drugs, or some slam at marriage, or some slam at church, or Christian, whatever it may be, it's going to be an extremely rare thing. And all I need to tell you, we need to be careful about these choices that we are making, because ultimately they are going to affect who we are. These bodies. Jesus took a body. The Bible tells us that these bodies are the temple of the very Holy Ghost Himself. And as if to emphasize the importance of the body, the Bible also tells us that there's coming a day when both Christians and not Christians are going to be judged for the deeds done in the body. These are not scrap. They are not junk. They are the creation of God to be used for His glory. Dear Jesus, please help us today. The busyness it imposes, the basics it ignores, and the bitterness it inflames. Ladies and gentlemen, this world is not, never has been, and never will be a friend of grace. We're living on two completely different planes. They have one philosophy, and we have another philosophy. We don't live in the same sphere. The world hated Jesus and Paul, and Jesus said the servant is not above his Lord. We don't need to have a persecution complex to understand that Satan and his servants have us in the crosshairs of their opposition. Now, we have been unusually blessed in the United States of America, and I'm going to finish this section, and some of you look like you're already finished, so I may quit. I do have a couple of other things that I feel like I need to say, because on Saturday I'd like to come back and I'd like to talk to you about some things that we can do about our clash with the culture and confusion within the church and the circumstances that we meet as individuals. There are some things that we can do, and I'd like to talk about it, but you'll have to, some of you need to, I saw you straightening up, sir. That's probably what some people need to do. Get your back stretched a little bit, and if you're really falling asleep, stand up. It's all right. In Central America, when they start to get sleepy, they stand up. Now, blessedly, most of them lean up against a wall, because I've always been fearful when I see them stand up, and if they go back to sleep, I'm always fearful that they're just going to fall over, but most of them at least try to find a wall to lean on. So if you're sleepy, move around a little bit and give me just a couple more minutes or a few more minutes and let me kind of unload my burden this morning, and then I'll try to get out of your hair. We've been unusually blessed in the United States of America. Our founding fathers and our founding documents have provided a momentum for righteousness and godliness and goodness in our nation. And the revival awakenings, or the awakenings and the revival of the past, have also blessed us in the memories of what we one time were. But I need to tell you that most of that has just about run its course. And now it's coming down to you and me. What are we going to do about it? Okay? Now, there is also confusion within the church. And I have so much on my heart, I hardly know how to approach it. But let me kind of quickly see if I can run through it. There's confusion in the church because the church has forgotten who and what it is supposed to be. The Bible says the church is to be the bride of Christ. That talks to me about the fact that we are to be virtuous, a pure church, a holy church. The Bible also says that we are to be like an army terrible with banners. That tells me we are supposed to be a victorious church as well as a virtuous church. And the Bible also tells us that as a church we are commissioned by the Spirit. We are to be a vigorous church. Vigorous, virtuous, and victorious is what we're supposed to be. But where are we? And who are we? Well, there are activities that we ought to approve, and we ought to have buses if your situation calls for it, and calling programs, and evangelism, and bands, and prayer meetings in the home, and visiting people who can't get out, and going to nursing homes and jail service. We ought to be doing those kind of things. But what happens is that oftentimes we get caught up in the glamour of the activities and forget that there is a spiritual life that we are supposed to be edifying and building. And I'm going to try to get to that on Saturday, the Lord willing. Here are some of the dangers, the problems that I see. First of all, there is among us, or in our holiness movement in general, there is out and out compromise. Compromise of doctrinal purity and clarity. And we're going to be holiness people. I'd suggest we learn what we're all about and get our doctrine straight, and then not only preach it and teach it, but by the grace of God, live it. And this is what happens when we, just like I said the other day, you know, the erosion of character begins with the compromise of principles. And I'm going to give you an illustration of what's happening right now in the United States of America in a holiness church. When years ago, probably you could count it back to mostly to the 40s, where it would start, and they started compromising the principles that had distinguished them up to that time for about 80 years. If they vote on and vote in favor of the doctrinal statement that is under consideration, they will no longer by doctrine even be a holiness church. They are dropping the secondness of entire sanctification. They are dropping the purity of entire sanctification. They're a holiness church, at least in name, but little by little they have been compromising, and now they're going to compromise doctrinal purity and clarity. Are you still here? Well, are you still with me? Are you still loving me as much as you did when I started? But there's compromise not only of doctrinal purity, but of lifestyle issues. And I know that I've touched on this, so I'm not going to grind it into the ground. I just need to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that holiness of experience will express itself in holiness that is ethical. And those ethics touch every area of our lives. We cannot take God's money, for example, and gamble God's money in the lottery or the office pool or whatever else it may be. That's not our money to use like that. And yet, some of you who work out in the world, it's a lifestyle issue that you have to face. Well, I sure would have liked that $290 million, Brother Sankey, in the last big whatever Powerball or whatever it was. I would too. You say, Brother Sankey, it'd ruin you. I'd like for it to try. You say you couldn't get rid of even the cash that you'd get out of it, which I think they said was going to be, what, $160 million or something. You couldn't get rid of $160 million. Put it in my hand and let me try. I walked into a Kentucky Fried Chicken within the last 7 days. The manager was behind the counter, and a girl was waiting on me. And the manager stopped, and she looked at me, and she said, "Are you a preacher?" I didn't look much like a preacher, I admit. Dressed, if you'll excuse the expression, I dressed kind of casually. She looked at me, she said, "Are you a preacher?" And I said, "Yes, I am." She said, "I need you to pray for me." And I said, "Well, ma'am," I said, "I would be happy to. What do you want me to pray?" She said, "I want you to pray that I'll win that lottery so that I don't have to work." And I said, "Well, ma'am, I don't think I can do that." And we laughed together. She went and sat down with friends at a table, and I thought about it just for a few moments, and I went back to her, and I said, "Ma'am," I said, "do you pay your tithes?" I said, "I might reconsider." Not really. But ladies and gentlemen, there is an ethics that flows out of the sanctified experience. We are faced with lifestyle issues. It does affect the way we dress. It does affect our choice of entertainment. You don't have to be quite as rigid and as ignorant as I am on the music issue. I admit I'm very close-minded, and I don't make any bones about it. And I kind of get myself in a bad reputation, but I'll just tell you, I'm just pretty much locked into a traditional hymn music type of that's where I am, and it's where I'm going to stay. You don't have to be exactly there, but I will tell you this. Again, it's lifestyle issues. A philosopher of the past said, "I would rather write the songs of a nation than write its laws, because the music will have more effect on the people than its laws will." Now you stop and think about it. You stop to think about the 40-some years that have gone by since rock and roll was introduced into the United States culture, and see what it has done to our culture. Congress can legislate all they want to, but if you have hundreds of thousands, or as you say, you have 60,000 people in one place listening to the junk and the trash that most of the rock and roll musicians are putting out, and getting that into their mind and into their thinking, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have the kind of thing like we had in the White House a few years ago. And again, I'm not trying to be unkind, but the first president raised on rock and roll music was that gentleman that was in the White House, with what seems to me no concept of what is moral and what is right and what is wrong, because that kind of music takes that all away. It is anti-parent, it is anti-church, it is anti-Christian. And so to me, anything that even smells or looks or sounds like that kind of music has nothing to do with a man or a woman who is deeply in love with Jesus and filled with the Holy Spirit. We don't want anything that even sounds that way. But it's a lifestyle issue. Some of the popular singing groups, they may still be singing gospel, but they are introducing that kind of rhythm and that kind of beat, which eventually will just be a short step over into the rest of the popular music world. And I guess I understand why I don't get many invitations for camp meetings, because I know that, that not everybody has to agree with me. But I'm trying to tell you, trying to set up some warning systems here and some alarm systems that will help us to understand that all around us is a culture that is drawing us and dragging us away from whom we are supposed to be. If you're a graduate of this school, I want you to forgive me, but what happened at Wheaton College? When 2 years ago they allowed certain things that they had restricted all through their history. And then this year, or maybe last year, they allowed even more things that they had restricted. What happened? Well, Wheaton was founded by a Methodist circuit rider. and maintain certain ethics all down through their history until about 5 years ago. And little by little, they started chipping away. Until now, the things that 5 years ago they would have said will never be on this campus are on that campus. The dancing, the social drinking. Probably they had allowed tobacco use before that. I don't know. I was on another campus, another holiness campus, not too long ago, talking with a friend of mine who was on staff. And somehow we got into this area, and I know that he doesn't agree with IHC. I know he doesn't agree with the Pilgrim Holiness, but he's an acute and an astute observer of history. And I said to him about this particular school, let me call it School X. I said, well, sir, do you see these changes happening here at School X? You've been here many years. Have you seen those? Oh, yes. He said, it's one of the reasons why I'm leaving. Because it finally got to where I couldn't handle the changes that they're making. And so here are these things that are given to us. The entertainment mode. Here's another confusing thing, and this will come closer to affecting people right in this auditorium on this Thursday morning, and I promise I'm going to quit. The small versus the mega church. This is something that affects us, even in our holiness movement. We read Rick Warren and his church, and we read Bill Hybels and his church, and we say, well, what are we going to do about that? Sometimes, not necessarily those gentlemen, because I don't know too much about them, but sometimes people in the mega churches can make those of us who are in the non-mega churches feel like maybe we're even sinful because we're so small. And so the pressure is on the pastor to do something about that. A little bit here, a little bit there, a little bit of an adjustment. You say, well, Brother Sankey, should we seek for our churches to grow? Absolutely. We ought to do everything that is legitimate within the scope of Scripture to try to reach as many people, just like has been said here, to reach as many people as we can. If somebody reached you, as somebody said, there's a dozen bills around most of our churches. If someone would have the passion and the compassion and the desire and the ability to go out and touch them for Jesus, of course we should grow our churches. And all I would say is that we dare not grow our churches at the sacrifice of biblical principles. One of the more interesting articles, and I don't have time to read it. I don't know who the man is, but I found this article. Again, I picked it up on Monday before coming up here. The seeker-friendly way of doing church. And he gives a critique of the mega churches. Well, let me close this morning by saying this. If you're in a small church, I heard somebody since I've been on this campground say that I wasn't in on the conversation, I just walked by and I heard a lady say to a man or a lady, I don't know who it was, and she was saying, she said, well, you know, when they leave, we're just going to have a handful. What are we going to say? Well, first of all, I'd like to say we ought not to be satisfied. If we are small, don't just sit back and not do anything about it. Do the best that you can. But on the other hand, we ought not to despise the day of small things. I thought, Joe, about your introduction to this book and your mom and dad pastoring during the Depression and wondering about some of those little West Virginia churches. And yet, how many people were won to the Lord out of those West Virginia mining towns. Church in Greenville, where I grew up, I don't know that it ever had many more than 60 people. At its best. I checked the statistics in 1962 when I came into the conference as a preacher. 1962, Sunday school average was 60. Membership was maybe 35 or something like that. I don't know. Never very big. But out of that little church have come any number of people who are even today out in the mission field and out in preaching. I was so touched by Harry Plank. We had him for our evangelist last week at our indoor camp meeting. And I think if I remember what he said, that little Brethren in Christ church out in the Pennsylvania countryside was running somewhere between 20 and 30. But it touched Harry Plank. God saved him. And now he's a leader in God's missionary church out of a time. And what I'm saying by that, don't give up and don't quit and don't be satisfied. But don't let the big boys come along and make you feel just like you're a terrible failure because you don't have 1,000 people or 5,000 people. Except for Paul Pierpoint, and that mostly in the wintertime, who of us can talk about 1,000 people in our churches? We just don't think in those terms. If somebody gets up to 100, we're clapping, and saying hallelujah. Somebody's up to 100. Somebody gets up to 200, we say, wow, that's really something. And then you have that church out in Pennsylvania that's up to 300, and then there's another one in Pennsylvania up to 500, and then we begin to think, well, I wonder what they're doing. They're probably compromising. We're strange people. But I need to stop. You're tired, and I think I am. But I just need to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, there is confusion in the church. And there's a confrontation with the culture. And I have a whole other section that I wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk about the circumstances that come to us that have a tendency to blur our vision of God. But if you'll come back on Saturday, and if the Lord will allow me, I want to talk to you a little bit about some things that I believe positively we can do. Let's take this to the Lord. Father, thank Thee this morning for the wonderful, wonderful privilege of being the people of God. We have been redeemed not with silver and gold, but we've been redeemed by the precious blood of Christ. Jesus said, maybe a word to us here in this tabernacle this morning. Jesus said, fear not, little flock, for it is the Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Lord, we just want to be in the place of blessing, where we are pleasing Thee above everything else. Help us, Lord, in our confrontation with the culture. If we happen to be in a church situation that's causing us confusion, help us, Lord. Even as the ladies played earlier today, we were listening and they played, turn your eyes upon Jesus. Look full in His wonderful face, and the things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of His glory and grace. Father, help us to get a new grip on God and a clearer vision of Jesus, and help us as we walk carefully before Thee. In Jesus' name and for His sake, amen. God bless you. You're dismissed, and we'll be back tonight for the service with Brother Stetler. Let's pray that God will anoint him one more time for that service.